The Big Show.
All right, Greg, you are one. By the way, everybody knows Greg. He's NFL Films legend, NFL Matchup Show. You check him out on social media at Greg Cosell. If you're not familiar with Greg, then, well, I'm glad you're listening to the show for the first time. That's amazing. Thank you for coming, because Greg's with us every week, year round, because he's the man. Greg, you're one of the few people, I think, that really knows coaches. And not only talking with them, but I mean, you have a pretty good feel from studying them for years, what to expect from certain coaches. I guess I'm curious, when like the Arizona Cardinals hire Drew Petzing, the quarterback coach from the Browns, as OC, or Nick Rallis, the linebacker coach from the Eagles, as their DC, these guys have no track record. So, correct. Number one, do you have an idea of what to expect from them? Or number two, are you just kind of excited to see what they're all about, what they bring to the table, because you don't really know?
Russ, before we do that, I just want to tell you that at the Super Bowl, and I meant to tell you this last week, you know, they have the big NFL tailgate party, which I get to go to. And I want to tell you that so many people recognize me from being with you. So I just want to tell you that it was really nice that's how they recognize me. And so I just want to share that with you.
That's awesome. I love it. Yeah. Well, your clips on social media for sure do very, very well. And Jack's done a great job of helping us spread those.
So getting back to coaches, young coaches, you really don't look Nick Rallis. I've heard great things about him. Okay. Because he was with the Eagles. I've never met him personally. I don't know if you have, because I know you do the Eagles preseason games. So I don't know if you've had a chance to speak with him at any point. But obviously he does not have a lot of experience with different schemes and different systems. And Jonathan Gannon is the head coach, and it will be his scheme, even though he has announced that Nick Rallis will be the play caller on defense. But he's essentially going to be dealing with Jonathan Gannon's scheme. Now, again, we don't know how he'll call certain situations. We know that play calling very often comes down to situational football. Young coaches, because they don't have a lot of background, Ross, in different systems. And there's one coach I want to get to in a minute, which is a little different. We'll get to the Tampa Bay offensive coordinator in a second. But young coaches like that, you don't really know because they don't have a lot of experience. I was told years ago by a veteran coach who's no longer coaching, but coached in the NFL for almost 40 years and probably coached 50 years total, close to it, that coaches coach what they know. And that makes really good sense. And I even heard Todd Monken say that in a press conference this week. And Todd Monken is obviously the new OC for the Browns. And he was making the point that, hey, you coach what you know. And young coaches will do that more than veteran coaches who've maybe been exposed to more systems.
That's interesting. People always want experience, and I get that, but I wonder if, and I know the Eagles felt this way, Greg. I know they did. In 2021, they feel like there's a competitive advantage when it's new coaches, young coaches that don't have a track record.
Right.
I know the Eagles did not want to showcase what Steichen and Gannon were going to do in training camp or the preseason in 2021 because they felt like for the first few games, people wouldn't really have a very good idea of what they were going to do.
And, that's fair as well. Steichen obviously was an OC with a totally different kind of quarterback than Jalen Hurts. So, in that sense, even though he's still a young coach and now he's obviously the head coach in Indy, and he just hired a guy I know pretty well, Jim Bob Cooter. I don't know if you got a chance to know him in the 1 year he was with Philly. He was with Jacksonville last year, but he was also the OC when Matthew Stafford had 3 really, really good years in Detroit. So, but Steichen is someone that has a background with different kinds of quarterbacks. So, you don't know what he's going to run. First of all, we don't even know who their quarterback is. So we don't know what he's going to do. But the point about young coaches not having, a strong sample size, so other teams don't know for sure what they're going to do. That makes sense as well. The flip side of that argument is there's a lot of people who believe, and there's no right or wrong to this stuff, Ross, obviously. The flip side is that, hey, if you're a young head coach, first-time head coach, a lot of people believe you should hire veteran coordinators. Obviously, Jonathan Gannon did not feel that way. And that, like I said, there's no right or wrong here.
Any of the recent coordinator hires really jump out to you before we dive into the quarterbacks? Anybody that really you took note of?
I'm fascinated by Dave Canalis in Tampa because he was with the Seahawks for 13 years and he was exposed to many different systems. The last number of years it was Shane Waldron was the OC who came from the Rams. Brian Schottenheimer was there. I'm trying to remember who was there before. I guess Darrell Bevel. So he was exposed to many different systems, Ross. So again, we don't know what he's going to do, what he loves. It's like bands and music. When you start up and, you spend your time, if you're a rock band, you listen to all the 70s classic rock, you listen to the 80s, and then you decide, hey, what do I really like? What do I want my sound to be? Canalis has a lot in his background. And I'm really curious. Obviously, they're probably looking somewhere along the line for a quarterback as well. And that can dictate the approach you take or what you stress and emphasize more so than other things. But I'm really curious to see what he does in Tampa because he has a multiple background with many different systems.
Will be interesting for sure. It's pretty unbelievable, Greg. Just one last thing. I saw where Vic Fangio is getting $4.5 million a year to be a coordinator with the Miami Dolphins. Look, as you and I always say, the money is the money, the market's the market. It's just, It just goes to show you how important franchises now think those positions are.
Oh, no question. I mean, and Vic Fangio, he was, even though he did not coach this year, he was consulting quite a bit with a number of teams, and he's considered a savant when it comes to defense. He's been doing it a long time. I've gotten a chance to speak to Vic briefly over the years, not enough to say that I know him well, but he is definitely considered a savant, Ross. He's considered one of those guys, and that's a really good hire for Mike McDaniel.
So we'll talk more about quarterbacks next week, and you'll actually be at the combine. So you'll see if some of these guys throw. You might be able to see some of them throw in person, maybe not. I guess I'm just curious. We'll talk more about it next week, Greg, but anybody at any level you ever talk to, they talk about how important it is to see the person throw live in person. When it's college recruiters for high school kids, NFL scouts they want to see the ball come off their hand, which I think a lot of people would say, well, I don't get it. You've watched them, you've watched the tape of every throw a guy's ever made. Why do you feel like that's so important, Greg? Or maybe you don't. I don't know.
Everybody says that. You probably get a different feel. Look, I sit here in my office at NFL Films and I watch a ton of tape. That's what I do. And I'm in the process right now of finishing up Anthony Richardson. And I've seen a number of the other quarterbacks, and I watched a bunch of them last summer as well from their 2021 tape. But I think you get a different feel. And I'll give you a great example. I remember the year Josh Allen and Sam Darnold came out. The night before the quarterbacks worked out, Jordan Palmer, who worked with both guys and still does, I believe, he invited me to the second floor in the dome in Indy because he was just going through a workout with Allen and Darnold because they were going to throw the next day. That was the quarterback day. And standing next to Josh Allen and watching him throw, and granted, he's just one of those guys in terms of arm strength. It's a different experience than watching him on film. Obviously, on film, you say he's got a great arm because, he does. But standing next to him, I mean, I was standing 2 feet away from him while he's throwing a football. It's a different feeling. And I think, you don't necessarily come away with a different view. I knew he had a great arm from tape, but you just come away. It's more visceral. You just feel it differently when you stand next to a guy watching him throw a football.
Let's dive into the top guys, Greg. Do you have a guy from what you've watched? A lot of people are thinking there might even be four first-round picks out of these quarterbacks. Is there a guy that you've watched that really jumps out to you?
It's really interesting for me, Ross, because there's always things I think about when I watch. Because if you polled 15 quarterback coaches in the NFL, and you said, give me the 12 traits that are important for a quarterback in the NFL, they probably have the same list of traits. The question becomes, what value do they ascribe to those traits? Some quarterbacks might ascribe value and say, hey, if he can't throw it from the pocket on 3rd and 9, he can't play in this league. If he can't stand there and deliver when there are bodies around him, he can't play in this league. Another coach might say, hey, the way the game has changed, if he can't move around, he's going to have a hard time. So it really comes down to what value do you ascribe to certain traits. You look at, and I'll speak to Anthony Richardson because I'm in the process of sort of finishing him up now. I watched him last summer, every play that he had because he wasn't the starter. And now I'm watching 7-8 games from this year. And he is being talked about as a high-level traits quarterback. And I'm going to have this conversation with coaches at the Combine. So when you say that, what are you saying? Richardson obviously has a big arm, and he's a big guy, and he can run. So you're talking size, arm strength, and running ability. He's really not particularly good from the pocket at this point. He's very scattershot in terms of his ball placement. So how do you weigh those traits, Ross? And that comes down to how coaches see it. Can you teach Anthony Richardson the subtleties, the nuances, the details of playing quarterback because you feel really good about the fact that, man, this guy can threaten defenses all over the field. He can run. I mean, he had an 80-yard touchdown run against LSU. You don't really see that with quarterbacks. So it all comes down to how you see traits. Then you'll look at someone like Bryce Young, who I think is a terrific football player. I think the way he plays the position is high level. But he's going to be 5'11 and a half, maybe 200 pounds. So is he an outlier? Is he an exception? But then you put the tape on, and first of all, if you meet the kid is absolutely special. And I've met the kid, and I know the parents. The kid's unbelievable. But how do you deal with 5'11", maybe 198 pounds? That will be a discussion in draft rooms. And I'm not saying he won't be drafted high because the tape is so good in all areas. He knows how to play quarterback. He changed plays at the line of scrimmage. He understands defense. He understands everything. But that's a big question. His size is a question.
Nobody asked me. Nobody cares what I think.
That's not true, Ross.
No, here's what I would say. The guy, he doesn't take that many big shots because he has a subtle way of avoiding them a lot, number one. Number two, I've heard this stuff with some receivers recently. Devontae Smith, his ankles were too skinny. He was too skinny. I think the game has changed in the sense that, the lighter you are, Greg, a lot of times the easier it is to move around, to get in and out of your break. There's receivers that they used to say, oh, he's an outlier. He only weighs 165 pounds at receiver, or Hollywood Brown, or any of these guys. The job of that position, receiver, is to get open. And I think sometimes with those guys not carrying as much weight, it's easier for them to get in and out of their breaks when they're running their routes. And I think for a quarterback like Bryce Young,
yeah.
I mean, would it be nice if he was 220? Yeah, but if he was 220, he probably wouldn't be able to make guys miss and have those subtle movements that he's able to do because he's only 195.
Yeah, and 2 quick points. By the way, there's a receiver in this draft like that named Tank Dell from the University of Houston. We'll get to receivers down the road. But the point you made about Bryce Young is 100% correct, Ross. He has a great feel for where people are. He has a great feel for spatial awareness. He finds places to deliver the football. That's an innate feel that he has. Patrick Mahomes has that as well. Now, Mahomes is a bigger man. Mahomes has a tremendous feel for space and where people are, and we know how phenomenal he is at doing that. Young is not as big a man as Mahomes, but Young has that same kind of special, innate feel. And we'll see. Look, all I'm saying is, and like I said, I think his tape is phenomenal. I love the player on tape, but it will be a conversation. Just like Devonta Smith was a conversation. It seems silly now because he's a really good player, but it's a conversation only because they're exceptions.
Two more guys I want to ask you about for sure this episode. We'll get to more and your thoughts from the Combine next week, which is very exciting because you'll be talking to coaches and you'll be watching some of these guys. Let's talk C.J. Stroud, Greg.
Yeah. C.J. Stroud throws the ball really, really well. He's I wouldn't say has a gun, but he can make every single throw. He has a great feel for pace and touch, which is a really important trait. See, there's a more refined, subtle trait that is really important to have. Someone like Anthony Richardson does not have a feel for pace and touch. He can't really feather and layer throws when it's demanded. And, let's say you're throwing a shallow cross. You can't throw that 100 miles an hour. Stroud has a really natural feel for what kind of throw is required, and he can make those throws. The question you always face with quarterbacks at Ohio State, and this is not Ryan Day's fault, his job is to win games at Ohio State, is the quarterbacks at Ohio State are rarely under any pressure. And the system is so good that the throws are really well-defined and clear. And, then when they get to the NFL, it's not quite that simple. And we've seen Ohio State quarterbacks at times struggle with that. I'm not saying C.J. Stroud will or won't. That's just, as I said, these are all conversations that will be had in meetings as teams now start their draft preparation and go to the Combine. But Stroud throws a really pretty ball. I think there'll be a lot of people that really like him just because of the way he throws.
Last guy I wanted to ask you about, and I totally agree about the Ohio State guys. I'm not blaming them, but I've told you this before. Every game you watch, there's like no pressure on them, and the receiver is like wide open. It's like Chris Olave, touchdown.
Right.
Now, I will say this. He moved a lot better than I thought and played a lot better than I thought against Georgia.
And that's the game people will look at, because prior to that game, people felt like this guy does not have the kind of movement that would be required at some point in the NFL.
Last guy is Will Levis, another one that seems to be, man, some people are really, really high on him and others are not. He seems to maybe be the most polarizing, him and Richardson, I guess.
Because then you get into the specific traits. As I said when we started this, he's big, he's physical, and he has a great arm. So you look at those things and then you say, okay, I can make him a quarterback. Now, he played in two NFL systems. He had Liam Cohen, who was there 2 years ago when he had the better year. He had Rich Scarangella, who was there this year. And you probably know who that is. He was with the Eagles for 1 year. He's been in the NFL for years. Didn't quite have the same year that he had the year prior. But he's one of those traits guys. Now, he's tough as nails, supposedly a great kid. The tape tells you he's really tough and physical. I need to do more work on him from this year, so we'll get to that. So I don't want to say things that I haven't quite seen yet from this past year. I know just from seeing some TV games, and I don't know the reason for this, but it seemed to me that there were too many times he got stuck in the pocket and got sacked. Now, again, I can't speak to the reason for that until I see the tape. But he's, 6'3", 235, a whip of an arm, physical, running ability, good athlete. There are going to be people who love him and believe that, we'll make this guy a really good quarterback.
Interesting. Well, when you get a chance to watch more of him from this year, then I'm going to, and maybe it'll be next week or whatever, I want to circle back on him because I am curious to see what you think of him from this year. He's the great Greg Cosell, at Greg Cosell. He'll be joining us from his hotel room, probably at the Combine.
More than likely,
week.
Yes. Yeah.
Which will be great. Really, really looking forward to that. Love when you're on the scene, and I'll make sure to ask you more about Levis next week. Great stuff on Stroud, Richardson, and Bryce Young for sure. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thanks, Ross. Appreciate it.